Thank you very much, Matt. Thanks both for the kind introduction and the invitation to join you today. Thanks all of you for turning out on a Saturday. I know there are other things you could be doing with your time, and I appreciate that you've elected to do this. So as Matt said, I work for an organization called the Institute for Justice down in the United States. The Institute for Justice is a nationwide public interest libertarian law firm. And I want to talk a little bit at first about what that means, just to kind of frame the rest of what we're talking about. So we're a public interest law firm. That means a couple things. One, it means we represent our clients free of charge. Two, it means, unlike private sector lawyers who just get hired to advance their client's interest, we are retained to advance a broader principled vision. We advance a vision of American constitutional law under which people can control their own destinies as free and responsible members of society. And we strategically take cases where government is overreaching in order to advance that vision. That's what it means to be a public interest law firm, and specifically, we're a libertarian public interest law firm. We fight against overreaching government in 4 key areas. We defend educational choice, we defend private property rights, which we're going to hear a little more about later this afternoon. We defend free speech, and we defend economic liberty, which is your right to earn an honest living free from unnecessary interference by the government. All of these rights are under constant assault. Frequently when I go around and travel, I talk about specifically the U.S. Constitution, and the U.S. Constitution's protection for property rights or economic liberty, where those protections come from, what they're used for. But I wanted to do something a little broader this time, something to see if there was some way to take the lessons from my practice of law and from my defense of freedom and draw maybe some broader lessons that might be relevant to a Canadian audience, notwithstanding the fact that Canada is, as I was immediately reminded upon my arrival, ranked higher than the US on the scale of economic freedom. So really, you should all be telling me what to do. But I think the big thing I can draw, the big thing I've learned from spending the past several years fighting against overreaching government, I think actually doesn't have anything to do with the American Constitution. It doesn't have anything to do with American law. It has to do with government, and more specifically, it just has to do with groups of people and how we can expect groups of people to behave when they get together. And I was thinking about how to frame this talk, sort of similarities and differences between the American and Canadian political systems. And one similarity that struck me is both the American and the Canadian political systems, like basically every Western democracy, frame their discussions of politics as discussions of political parties. If we get my group of people in, things will be better. If we get those bastards out, things will be better. If those bastards get in, they'll ruin everything. And a lot of discussions of politics are framed as battles not between ideas, but battles between political parties. And I think that's true here. I think that's true in the US. I lived in London for a time. It was definitely true there. That political parties seem to stand in almost for ideas, and battles between political parties seem to stand in for battles between ideas and ideologies. And I think it's problematic in a certain way. But one thing I think the US does differently and more effectively than Canada in waging this fight is that American political parties have animal mascots. This is a major flaw in the Canadian political system. Are people generally familiar with this, the idea that American parties have mascots? So there's the Democrats, who are, does anyone know what the Democrats have in the United States? They're a donkey, yes. So the Democrats are a donkey. I think this actually means more than you think it does. The Democrats, they're traditionally the left-wing party in the United States. They believe in a donkey. He's inoffensive, he's innocuous, he will carry things for you, he'll do your chores for you. It's really the democratic vision of government, right? This is the Democrats' ideal. It's their ideology is the donkey. And the other major party in the United States is the Republicans, and they're represented by, yes, the elephant. He's large, he's frightening, he will stomp on your enemies, he will stomp on people standing near your enemies. He's the Republican ideological vision of government, and Canadian political parties don't have animal mascots. And I think if they had animal mascots, it might help crystallize the ideology of different parties. And I was actually thrilled. I was thinking about this. And it turns out the Montreal Gazette agreed with me, and actually has I don't know if anyone saw their cartoon series. They've proposed animal mascots for the various Canadian political parties, including the Bloc Québécois, which is represented by Pepe Le Pew, and the Conservative Party, which is represented by a weasel. Though they're quick to point out all political parties are represented by a weasel. I think this is helpful. I think it's a way to discuss the ideology of different political parties, but I also think it's wrong. The American parties have their own mascot. The Montreal Gazette's cartoon series, adorable as it is, has their own mascots. I think, really, both major US political parties and the major political parties in Canada really all have the same mascot. And I think it's the Easter Bunny. He's friendly, he's cheerful, he has a little basket of goodies that he's going to give out. Different parties have different visions of who should get the goodies he's giving out. But I think essentially, when you listen to most political rhetoric, we're not talking about elephants, we're not talking about donkeys, we're not even talking about Pepe Le Pew. We're talking about the Easter Bunny. We're talking about what wonderful things government is going to do for you and yours, and why you should get on this particular ideological bandwagon. Now, you might expect that I, being of a more libertarian bent, dissent from the Easter Bunny vision of politics. And I actually don't. I think the Easter Bunny is the right mascot. I just have a slightly different vision of the Easter Bunny. I think the Easter Bunny hates you. You see the Easter Bunny one day a year. You see the Easter Bunny, there's supposed to be sound for this, which makes it even more appalling. You see the Easter Bunny one day a year. You see the Easter Bunny on Easter. And what does he do? He brings you candy. He brings you chocolate eggs. He inexplicably hides things in your parents' house and yard, which should be creepy, but isn't creepy, because he's the Easter Bunny. What does he do the other 364 days of the year? You don't see that. You don't see the Easter Bunny out on his off days. And I think government is like this. Government is like this in an important way. Because what you see government do is not everything government does. What you see government achieve is big things. You see government spending. Sometimes you see government confiscation of wealth. That one's always hard to time. You see government spending, you see government projects, you see things government builds, you see government protecting people from criminals, you see the police. What you don't see is what Frederick Bastiat calls the unseen. How many people here have read Eddie Bastiat? Excellent. I love that I can talk about Bastiat behind the background of a guy in a Easter Bunny suit just beating the crap out of people. You're just in time. So Frederick Bastiat says the central problem, if someone who wants to argue for liberty, if someone who wants to argue for freedom, is the problem of the unseen. Bastiat frames this in the context of what's called his famous broken windows fallacy. And it's very simple to understand. If someone breaks a window, it's very easy to say, when you look at that broken window, someone comes and fixes that window. And it's very easy to look at what you can see and say, this is wonderful. The guy who's fixing that window now has a job. If that window hadn't been broken, this window fixer wouldn't have a job. He'd be unemployed. It's wonderful. It's wonderful that that window got broken because now this guy is employed. And the difficulty is, you don't see what would happen in a world where that window didn't get broken. There's probably something even better that guy could do than waste his time fixing a window that shouldn't have been broken in the first place. There's probably something better you could do with the spare glass, other than repair a window that shouldn't have been broken in the first place. But it's difficult to persuade people of that, because people don't see that. You don't see the job that doesn't get done because someone's busy fixing the window. You just see the guy busily at work, gainfully employed, fixing his window. And that's in part what I think our work at the Institute for Justice helps solve. We seek out individuals who are being trampled by government in a way that exemplifies Bastiat's problem of the unseen. And I think there's no better example of that than this guy, Carlos Barragan, who is not nearly as scary as he looks in this picture. Carlos lives in California. He lives in a place called National City, California. And Carlos and his dad live in National City and always loved boxing. They're a boxing family. Carlos's dad boxed as a kid. Carlos boxed as a kid. And National City is not the world's greatest place. It's a poorer area. It's a slightly more crime-ridden area. And Carlos and his dad wanted to give back to the community. They looked around. They didn't like what kids were doing. Kids were getting into trouble. They were out on the street. So Carlos and his dad did the only thing they knew how to do. They hung a heavy bag in the backyard. They got the kids in the neighborhood to come, and they taught them how to box. Because boxing teaches discipline. Boxing teaches self-control. Boxing teaches strategic thinking. Boxing teaches physical fitness. Boxing teaches all of these important, wonderful things that the kids in Carlos's neighborhood weren't learning from anyone. And his program with his dad took off. It's been wildly successful to the point where they now have their own nonprofit organization called the Community Youth Athletic Center. And the Community Youth Athletic Center owns a gym in downtown National City, right in the neighborhood where these kids live. And demographically, Carlos's kids should be having all kinds of problems. They should be in prison. Based on their economic status, where they live, they should be in prison, they should be in gangs, they should be getting into trouble, and they're not. Carlos's kids go to college. Carlos's kids become police officers, they become firefighters. Carlos's kids go to libertarian seminars. They actually do, they do. The Community Youth Athletic Center is community redevelopment in the best sense of that word. It's taking kids who don't have a lot of opportunities, who don't have a lot of choices or chances in their lives, and it's teaching them, and it's not just teaching them boxing. You know, the Community Youth Athletic Center always says that the boxing is how you get the kids in the door. It's the fun thing, and then you surprise them with the tutoring, and the homework, and the other things, and it's an amazing program. It is everything you could possibly want a community program to be. The only thing it isn't is luxury condos. And that's a problem. Because the government of the city of National City really, really like it if the land where Carlos's gym sits were luxury condos, were taken through the government's power of eminent domain, what's sometimes called compulsory sale, taken by the government, forcibly taken from Carlos, and handed over to a private developer in National City, who has a plan to build luxury condos, who has a plan to build, essentially what my colleague Jeff Rose always likes to say, has a plan to build housing for people like me, for white guys with funny glasses. And that's a problem. That's a problem both because Carlos's gym does way more for the community than luxury condos ever could, but it's also a problem because the Community Youth Athletic Center owns its property, it owns its land. It's a nonprofit corporation, but it owns this land outright. But the city of National City wants to use government force to take the CYAC's land and hand it over to a private developer, not to build a road, not to build a school, not to build any traditional function of government, but to build luxury condos simply because it thinks people who live in luxury condos will pay more taxes to the city of National City. In the middle of the country is Ali Bokhari. Ali lives in Nashville, Tennessee. And Ali is a serial entrepreneur. Ali sees opportunities where I would never see opportunities. And several years ago, he looked around the city of Nashville, and Nashville is, has anyone ever been to Nashville? Nashville's a weird place. Nashville is the center of the American country music industry. And every single person in Nashville, this is not an exaggeration, everyone in Nashville, with a handful of exceptions, is either famous or is totally going to be famous someday. It is a strange town. Because of that, it's a very limo-heavy town. Everyone in Nashville rides a limo. You've never seen as many limousines as you have seen in Nashville, Tennessee. But Ali noticed there were basically only two types of service in town. There were expensive limo companies, people you would sort of rent to go to prom or to go to your wedding. And then there were taxi cabs that provided a pretty low level of service. A lot of people didn't like taxi cabs, and what there weren't were just kind of black sedan cars that you could hire cheaper than an expensive limo that would take you to your wedding, but that still provided, a better level of service and cost a little more than a taxi cab. And Ali, as entrepreneurs do, saw an opportunity that he wanted to fill. And he was wildly successful. He was wildly successful. People loved his business. It expanded to, I think at its height, he had 30 cars on the road in 2008. People loved this service. There were absolutely no problems. I've never seen any evidence that anyone complained to anyone about his customer service or the value of his service. The difficulty was with the government of the city of Nashville. You will start to notice a pattern in my stories. Because while Ali's business was successful, it was also a problem for expensive limo companies. Now, prior to 2008, Nashville actually had no regulations of limousines whatsoever. There was not a single law in the books that governed limousines at all. And for a big limo town, it's pretty remarkable that they didn't have any problems not having any limo laws at all. And they fixed that in 2008, after Ali's business got off the ground, by passing the strictest limo regulations in the United States, the centerpiece of which is a minimum fare of $45 for any given trip. And just to give you context, kind of the local economics in Nashville, before they passed this law, a trip with Ali to the airport would run you about $20. So the law more than doubles the price of Ali's service, coincidentally, purely coincidentally, doubles it to exactly the minimum price charged by the second most expensive limo company in Nashville. In case you were wondering how they got $45. But not everyone runs a large nonprofit. Not everyone is a serial entrepreneur like Ali Bakari. Some people are teenage kids. Some people are like Christian now. Christian lives in Arizona. And Arizona has a phenomenon called roof rats, which sound, and I think probably are, terrifying. I've never actually seen a roof rat. But roof rats are these sort of enormous, have anyone ever seen The Princess Bride? They're rodents of unusual size, and they get into your roof through sort of holes in your siding, and they chew your wiring, and they rip up your attic, and you can hear them up there, and it's creepy, and it's generally unpleasant. And so Christian Elf, as a high school kid, decided that instead of having a paper route, the way he was going to earn money to go to the movies and hang out with his friends, Christian was going to go around to his elderly neighbors with a ladder, chicken wire, and a staple gun, and say, hey, roof rats get in through the holes up in your attic, I'm going to staple chicken wire over the holes in your attic, and then you won't have roof rats. And his neighbors loved this. He's an industrious kid, he was a really nice kid, it was relatively cheap, and he kicked the roof rats out. And things were going swimmingly until Christian got a cease and desist letter from the Arizona State Board of Pest Control. And because what Christian was doing was attempting to control pests, it was illegal in the state of Arizona to attempt to control pests without first obtaining a license from the Arizona Board of Pest Control that would authorize you to use a wide variety of controlled, deadly, dangerous chemicals. It took years of education, you had to pass various tests on the safe use of these chemicals, and Christian would have to do all of this to deploy his very dangerous chicken wire and staple gun. This is Tanya Edwards and Bill Maine, and this is all going somewhere, I promise. I'm not just going to do this for 2 hours. This is Tanya Edwards and Bill Maine. They're a tour company where I live in Washington, D.C. They rent out Segway tours. They're called Segs in the City, and I know it's a very unfortunate name. I'm trying to drop them out of it. But Segs in the City, their basic business model is they rent out Segways, and you ride around on the Segway, and they take you around on a predefined route, and you drive past on your Segway, looking like a huge dork, all the big monument sites in Washington, D.C. Now, you're probably used to the twist by now. The government comes in somewhere, right? And you're probably thinking, the government's going to have some kind of regulation on Segways where there's a speed limit, or you have to carry insurance, or they just don't want Segways riding around down their streets. And you know what? The other stuff Bob talked about was pretty stupid, but I can see having traffic regulations on Segways. This one I'm actually going to side with the government on. Except none of that's the problem. Washington, D.C. has no objection to anything Bill and Tanya want to do on their Segways, to renting out the Segways, to driving around with groups of people on Segways. The problem is, when they rent out the subways and take the groups around, they also give you a little headset. And while you're riding around, Bill or Tanya or one of their employees rides around with you in a microphone and describes the things you see. And in Washington, D.C., it is illegal to describe things to people for money without first passing a test and obtaining a special license from the city. It is illegal to describe things. So if, for example, Bill and Tanya wanted to rent you a Segway and ride around with you in Washington, D.C. at top speeds, they'd be able to do that. There's no law against that. D.C. has no problem with that. D.C. police have no problem with that. If they wanted to do that and say, hey, over there's the National Archives, which is where they keep the U.S. Constitution, which has the First Amendment, which guarantees your right to free speech, they would be subject to significant criminal penalties. But the Segway can still be fine. Incidentally, if you ever get a chance to ride a Segway, which was my one condition of taking their case, that they let me ride a Segway, I do recommend it. This is Russ Caswell, and I talk about Russ because we're actually going to trial in Russ's case in about a month now. And you will hopefully start to see things about it in papers, even up here. Russ owns a motel in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, up in the northeast corner of the U.S. The motel is his retirement plan. He's paid off the mortgage on it. He and his wife own it free and clear. It is the family business. He is Russ Caswell. It is the Motel Caswell. And the difficulty is there's no mortgage on it, which makes it a wonderful retirement nest egg if you're Russ Caswell, and makes it a very, very attractive target if you are a thief, or, for example, the United States federal government. Russ is going to trial in a month with the Institute for Justice at his side, because the United States government, specifically the U.S. Attorney from Massachusetts, is trying to take his motel under a doctrine called civil forfeiture, which we're also going to hear more about later this afternoon from a Canadian standpoint. Now, the government's argument here is not, I want to stress, that Russ has committed any crime. Everyone agrees that Russ himself has never committed a crime. Russ himself has never possessed drugs, never sold drugs, never used drugs. Russ is actually really a straight arrow guy. Their argument is that sometimes the guests at the Motel Caswell, and this will be, you know, it's a striking allegation. Sometimes the guests at the motel use illegal drugs. It's shocking, but it seems true. Sometimes people in a motel like smoke marijuana. I didn't know this. But their theory actually is, and the crazy thing is they're not wrong. It's not that Russ is a criminal. It's that Russ's property is a criminal. Russ's property is home to drug activity. And it doesn't matter that Russ himself didn't engage in any crimes. It doesn't even matter that Russ himself called the police to ask them to come arrest people for using drugs on his property. All that matters is that there was drug use on the property. This is the theory of the U.S. federal government, and we're not going to let them win. That there was drug use on the property, that Russ could theoretically have done even more than he did to stop it. And therefore, the property can be forfeited entirely to the federal government, which then gets to keep the money and share it with government officials in the town of Tewksbury. It's straight up piracy. The money doesn't go just to the general United States fisc. It just goes to the government. Which is why the Motel Caswell, which is owned without a mortgage and owned by a guy and his wife who can't afford high-priced lawyers, is subject to civil asset forfeiture, and the Motel 6, which is a quarter mile down the road and has just as much drug activity, is not. This is law enforcement. This is piracy. This is Leroy Jones. Leroy Jones lives in Denver, Colorado. And he, as you can tell from the picture, is a taxi driver. Leroy drove a taxi for years, and he, as is the case with many of our clients, noticed an opportunity. There were only 2 taxi companies in Denver when Leroy started out, and they didn't provide very good service. They especially didn't provide very good service in certain neighborhoods. There were certain areas in the city where you just couldn't get a cab. They were usually the poorer areas of the city. They were usually, frankly, the areas where Leroy and his family members lived. Taxis wouldn't come to some neighborhoods. And so Leroy saw an opportunity. He did what we hope entrepreneurs will do. And he wanted to start a business. He said, you know what, there's this whole market that's not being served. My friends and I know the taxi business. We know how to run a profitable taxi business. We're going to start a taxi business, and we're just going to start serving all these areas that nobody seems to be serving. There are customers out there with money. We're going to take their money, and they're going to get service, and we're going to be rich. It's going to be great. Classic American plan. The only difficulty is Leroy lived in Denver, Colorado, and in Denver, Colorado, there were 2 taxi companies because it was illegal to start a third. It was actually illegal to start a taxi company in Denver, and remains illegal in many places in the United States. Illegal to start a taxi company unless you can first prove to the government that your taxi company is necessary. And what that means in practice is you have to prove that your new taxi company won't take any customers away from an existing taxi company. Which, if you think about it, is the point to starting a business, is to take customers away from an existing business that's doing a crappy job. That's like the whole idea. And you have to prove this in what amounts to full-blown litigation in which existing taxi companies get to participate. Now imagine if, before you were allowed to sell food in town, you had to sue Burger King and McDonald's over the question of whether the city had enough cheeseburgers. Does anyone even know what enough cheeseburgers looks like? It's not really a question with an answer. The way we usually figure out if a town needs a new restaurant is the restaurant opens up. And then if the town didn't need a new restaurant, no one goes to the restaurant, and then the restaurant closes. That's how we solve this grand mystery. So it's a question without an answer that you have to spend thousands of dollars litigating about with people who you already know their answer to the question. I don't know how you would answer the question of whether a town has enough cheeseburgers, but I can tell you both Burger King and McDonald's would say we have plenty of cheeseburgers and there's no need for a new cheeseburger restaurant. And that's exactly what taxi companies do when they're presented with this question. They're doing fine. The market's fine. The last thing it needs is for people like Leroy to come in, start their own small business, and take away their customers. That would be terrible. And that's why places like Denver end up with 2 taxi companies. That's why Little Rock, Arkansas has 1 taxi company. There's 1 taxi company in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's a crime to start a second taxi company. And this guy's my favorite. This is Abbot Justin Brown. He is a Benedictine monk. So some of our clients are entrepreneurs, some of our clients are high school kids, some of our clients are monks. It's a weird life we lead. Abbot Justin runs a group of Benedictine monks down in Louisiana. And Benedictine monks, I'm not sure if anyone knows kind of anything about the tradition, but one of the charges of St. Benedict when he set up his order is that his monks had to be self-supporting. They don't rely on contributions from the congregation, they don't rely on funds from the Catholic Church. Benedictine monks are supposed to go out into the world and earn their bread. They're not supposed to become wealthy, but they're supposed to earn the money they need for their food and for their health care. And the way Abbot Justin and his monks wanted to do that is they were great at woodworking. And they make these very traditional, beautiful but unadorned traditional Catholic caskets. Really lovely handmade caskets. And there was a huge uptick in demand for these after the previous pope died. A lot of Catholics watched the funeral. He was buried in this same kind of traditional casket. And so a lot of Louisiana caskets saw that on TV and thought, I would like to be buried in that. Where can I get one? You can get one at the St. Joseph's Abbey coming to Louisiana. The difficulty, and I know you're getting sick of this term, but so am I, and so are my clients. The difficulty is that in Louisiana, it's illegal to sell a casket unless you are a licensed funeral director. And if Abbot Justin and his monks wanted to sell their caskets, they would not only have to send one of their number to funeral directing school to learn embalmed bodies, to learn the various chemical arts of funeral directing, they would have to turn their abbey into a working funeral home. Just to sell a casket. And the fun thing is, this is actually the only rule Louisiana has about caskets. A casket is just a box. There's no rule about what a casket has to be made out of. There's no rule about how a casket has to be built or shaped or formed. In fact, there's no rule that says you have to be buried in a casket in Louisiana. You can just be wrapped in a shroud and buried in a shroud. The state of Louisiana has absolutely no interest in the casket industry. They do not care about the casket industry unless you are making money by selling one. And if you are making money by selling one, you have to give a cut to the funeral directors cartel. Only members of the funeral directors cartel are allowed to engage in this business. They can sell anything they want. They can sell exactly these caskets. And in fact, the funeral directors cartel offered to Abbot Justin that they would just buy the caskets from him and then sell them to the public at 125% markup. Of course, the difficulty is the charge to Benedictine monks is to go out and earn their bread, which means to sell things at a fair price, to sell things at the lowest price they possibly can. They're not supposed to get rich. Things aren't supposed to be sold at high prices. And that doesn't work for them. These caskets need to be sold relatively near their cost, and that's not what funeral directors want to do. That's not what funeral directors do. And so faced with the choice of either turning his abbey, his sacred home, into a funeral home, or abandoning the woodworking that he believes God has called his brethren to do, Abbot Justin took the third road and called the Institute for Justice. Now, I could do this all day, and sometimes I do. Sometimes I just get up and do 2 hours of IJ stories, because these don't stop. These stories are not anomalous. In the 1950s, about 1 in 20 members of the American workforce needed a special license from the government in order to do their jobs, in order to work. Today, that number's about 1 in 3. There's been an explosive growth in the kind of rules that keep people like Abbot Justin out of business, an absolutely explosive growth. There's been explosive growth in other kinds of American governmental power. I'm going to pivot in a second to what this means for being outside the context of the United States. But just one more point on American law. There's been an explosive growth in occupational licensing laws like these. There's also been an explosive growth in laws and restrictions in general. And just as an example, does anyone know how many federal crimes there are in the United States? How many acts there are for which the federal government of the United States can criminally punish you? Does anyone know?
Are you asking in this room or anywhere? Does anyone anywhere know the answer to that?
Have you seen me give this talk before? Was that a guess?
Too many.
Too many. Too many is good. But we've actually cut short. No. The answer to the question, does anyone know, and that was a good catch, does anyone know how many federal crimes there are in the United States, is no. Nobody knows how many crimes there are in the United States. And I think this should trouble us. I think this should give us some pause. And I think we should ask why this is happening. What is going on that causes this to happen? And the frame we talked about in the beginning, with the elephants and the donkeys and Pepe Le Pew, would tell us that this is going on because people in government are rotten people. We are electing villains who sit in their offices, twisting their mustaches and tying damsels to railroad tracks, and they do villainous things, and if we only get the villains out, this phenomenon will stop. Abbot Brown will be able to go forward. Christian Alf will be able to staple his chicken wire to his neighbor's roofs. And I don't think that's quite true, because I don't think what we're talking about is an American phenomenon. There are American examples, to be sure. But I don't think it's an American phenomenon. I think it's a phenomenon of government. I think it's a phenomenon of government at any level in any country, because I think fundamentally what we're talking about is just the nature of human beings when they form groups. And I think we would see exactly the same thing in this room, if this room were an isolated society unto itself. What's your name?
Grant.
Grant? Grant, let's imagine for a moment that I am the lawgiver for our little society in this room. And I'm considering everybody in the room give Grant $10 Act of 2012, which we'll call the Freedmen Puppies Act of 2012, because that's how these things work. Grant, how do you feel about the Freedmen Puppies Act of 2012?
Very happy.
Very happy. There's 30 people in the room. That's $300. It's a pretty good deal. What's your name?
Michael.
Michael, how do you feel about the Freedmen Puppies Act of 2012?
Relatively annoyed.
You feel relatively annoyed because you hate puppies. That's your thing, I can tell. Just violently hate puppies. Why are you relatively annoyed?
Because I have to give Grant $10.
You have to give Grant $10. Do you want to give Grant $10?
No, or I would have done it already.
Exactly. It's why it's fun giving these talks to libertarians, because they say things like, no, you know that because I would have done that. Thanks for stealing my joke. No, we know you don't want to give him $10. You haven't given him $10. You're perfectly free. He's 2 feet away. Just give him $10. You don't need the Freedom and Puppies Act. But Grant, how much money do you think you would spend to persuade me that the Freedom and Puppies Act of 2012 is a good idea? You're going to net about $300 from it.
This is a yearly stipend.
We'll call it a one-year appropriation. Everyone right now will have to give you $10.
Up to $299.
You'd spend $299. All right. Michael, how much money do you think you would spend to convince me not to pass the Freedom and Puppies Act of 2012?
$9.99.
Why only $9? Grant's going to spend way more. Why only $9.99?
Cost benefit analysis.
Well, because you're not insane. You're not going to spend $200 to avoid spending $10. And we know that because if you were willing to make that kind of trade-off, you would be starving and naked in the street. And instead, you're here and in a sweater. So obviously, you're not willing to spend $200 just to avoid having to spend $10. That would be insane. This phenomenon is not unique to small classrooms and absurd examples. This is what we see everywhere. Everywhere. And it's simple human nature that when you have a group of people making a decision, and there's a possible decision that will create concentrated benefits, Grant gets $300, with dispersed costs, everyone else is only out 10, the person who gets those concentrated benefits has every incentive to make that decision happen. And the person who has only the dispersed costs doesn't have much incentive to do much at all. And I want to be clear, we're not talking just about money here. It's not a matter of Grant's willing to pay me $299 and Michael's only willing to pay me $9. Effort is scarce. Attention is scarce. How many people in the room can tell me how many laws the Canadian Parliament has passed in the past 12 months? How many people can name at least 4 people who play goalie in the National Hockey League? Why is that? Is it because you're terrible people? Is it because you're just dazzled by sports and are somehow morally bankrupt and unwilling to pay attention to the Canadian Parliament? No! It's a Saturday and you're listening to a lecture on mostly American law. You're nerds. You're all huge nerds. And the people in this room don't know how many laws the Canadian Parliament has passed. Nobody knows how many laws the Canadian Parliament has passed. I would bet money there are many people in the Canadian Parliament who don't know how many laws the Canadian Parliament has passed in the past 12 months. And that's because knowing things is hard. You can't know everything in the world. You can't learn everything in the world. And so we triage. We spend some of our attention on some things, some on other things. And it's not because people are lazy. It's not because people are uninterested in politics. You guys are interested in politics. None of you is lazy. But nonetheless, you're not going to know everything the government does because most things the government does don't really affect you. The government names highways. The government designates a commemorative National Pickle Week. It does stupid stuff that you don't care about. Even if you were the most altruistic person with all the time in the world, you still wouldn't find out about everything they do because you wouldn't care. But the people who do care, the people who do find out, are the people who get the concentrated benefits. Abbott Brown is running afoul of the law in Louisiana about casket sales, but that's not the only outrageous law Louisiana has. We could actually shut down IJ's national operation and just sue Louisiana if we felt like it. Louisiana has a law in the books that makes it illegal to arrange flowers without a license. Literally, roses, baby's breath. Felony. And the way you could get a Louisiana Louisiana florist license, prior to IJ getting involved in the case, the only way you could get a Louisiana florist license was to pass a practical exam in which the subjective beauty of your floral arrangements was graded by, guesses? By existing Louisiana licensed florists. Do you think existing Louisiana licensed florists were relatively liberal or relatively stingy in deciding whether new florists should be allowed to compete with them? They were pretty picky. And actually, for the last year we had hard numbers. The passage rate for the Louisiana florist licensing exam was about half that of the Louisiana bar exam. It was harder to be a florist in Louisiana than to be an attorney. Being a florist is probably harder than being an attorney. I don't think it's twice as hard. But why would you expect a law like this? Because no one in Louisiana is going to base their vote for the state legislature on their legislator's position on the Louisiana Florist Act. The only people in the state who are going to base their vote for the state legislature on the Louisiana State Florist Licensing Act are licensed florists. Are the people on the inside get the concentrated benefits, and they're going to pay attention to your position. They're going to vote on your position. And so in a way, it doesn't matter whether we have the donkey or the skunk or the elephant in office. It doesn't even matter whether we have good people or bad people in office, because everyone in office knows if I vote yes on florist licensing, I get 500 votes. 500 people are watching, they'll all vote for me. If I vote no on florist licensing, no one will be aware, and 500 people are going to vote for my opponents. At that point, no matter how good you are, no matter how much you care about good government and righteousness and puppies and freedom, that's a simple calculus to make. And the people who don't make that calculus stop being in the legislature. You can be totally pure-minded. You can refuse to respond to the fact that there are these incentives out there. But you don't get reelected. Because the florists vote for someone else, because the funeral directors vote for someone else, because the interest groups vote for someone else. We're not talking about money, we're talking about attention, effort, voting, time, volunteering, all of these things. And so there's no incentive. There's no incentive for elected officials to do anything to curb the nonstop growth of laws like this. And that's why a third of the American workforce is subject to them now, when 5% of the American workforce was subject to them 50 years ago. And so at this point in the talk, I sometimes get people saying, okay, McNamara, you've persuaded me that when you have a guy at the front of the room passing laws, that sometimes they'll respond to these incentives, what are called public choice incentives, where you have the concentrated benefits and the dispersed costs, and he'll pass things like the florist licensing law. But isn't that just a problem of institutional design? Isn't it just a problem that the Louisiana legislature isn't responding to the true will of the people? What we need is more democracy, yes? The problem you're stating is with representative government, we need more democracy. We need the true will of the people to be expressed in all of these issues, and if everyone just got together and voted in a referendum on all these issues, you'd be happier, right? Because then the will of the people would be expressed, and that would be wonderful. I think that is equally problematic, and I want to spend a little time on this, because what I'm going to propose as a solution has very little to do with democracy, and has very little to do with the will of the people. And that's an incredibly important concept in kind of Western political thought. And I want to make sure we spend a couple minutes before we move on thinking about what it means to have the will of the people. So I have 5 people in the second row, yes? Yes, I need 5 people. So the second row is going to be a society. A society designed to acquire candy. And I would love to do this with Cadbury, but I had to buy these in the States, so you guys will bring these products. Now for this to work, everyone recognizes that individuals have preferences, right? What's your name? Yes?
Lainey.
Lainey. Lainey, I realize this is foreign American chocolate, but are you familiar with these?
Very much so.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on these candy products?
Well, I happen to like them all, but the Three Musketeers is my favorite.
The Three Musketeers is your favorite. Which of these is your least favorite?
Butterfinger.
Butterfinger is your least favorite. And so, knowing just those two facts about you, Lainey,
Yes.
knowing just those two facts about you, Lainey, I know that if you had a Butterfinger bar, and I offered to give you a Hershey bar for it, you would make that deal.
Yes.
And then I know if you had a Hershey bar, and I offered to trade you with Three Musketeers for it, you would also make that deal. Now notice, Lainey didn't tell me anything about how she felt about the Hershey bar. How is it that I can figure out what deals you would make when you didn't actually tell me anything about the Hershey bar?
Because you know my preferences about the
Because you're not insane. Because if one thing is first and the other thing is third, the thing is second. You have what we call ordered preferences. And again, we know you have ordered preferences because if you didn't, you wouldn't have made it here today. Say, well, I would rather put on my shoes. I'd rather turn left than turn right. I'd rather go backwards than turn right. But I'd rather go left than go backwards. And then you just go around in a circle all day. People don't act like that. People have ordered preferences. There's something they like best, there's something they like second best, and there's something they like third best. And they like the second best thing better than the third best thing. It's ordered preferences. It's how normal people think. And if you think about your own preferences, that's how your preferences work too. It's part of what it means to be a sane human being. That's not actually how groups of people behave. Individuals have ordered preferences. You can meaningfully say that you're responding to the will of an individual when you give them a Three Musketeers bar. You can't always meaningfully say that when you're talking about a group. And so just to make this work, I'm going to turn the second row here into a society, and I will eventually give out the candy. I learned long ago I have to purchase love. But just to make this work, I'm going to assign you all a letter with assigned preferences, because sometimes the Three Musketeers is just universally popular, and that proves the example. So Lainey, your favorite candy bar, just for the next few minutes, is going to be the Hershey bar,
Okay.
followed by the Three Musketeer bar, followed by the Butterfinger bar. So just for acting purposes, I want you to vote based on those preferences. What's your name?
Chris.
Chris, you're going to prefer Three Musketeers to Butterfingers to Hershey's. I want you to vote based on those preferences. You'll be C, you'll be D, you'll be E. Do all of you understand your preferences? Okay. Does someone want to count votes for row 2, someone who's not in row 2? You want to come to the front? Just so you can see them? Alright. So I'm going to start you out. Oh, you don't have to write them down. You'll just take a vote.
Okay.
I'm going to start you out with a gift. Right now, row 2 owns nothing. But I'm going to give row 2 a Three Musketeer bar. Because I'm kind. I'm a kind, benevolent dictator. But I'm also going to offer row 3 a choice. I will trade you, in exchange for that Three Musketeer bar, a Hershey bar. How many people in row 2 want to take that deal? Want to get a Hershey bar over a Three Musketeers? That's 3. And how many don't want to take that deal? How many want to keep your Three Musketeers? Okay, 3 to 2. So the will of the people says what?
They would rather have the Hershey's than...
They would rather have the Hershey bar. And this, for anyone who's had economics, this is a gain from trade. This makes everyone better off. You used to have a Three Musketeers bar. Now you have something you like better. You're better off. This is wonderful. This is how free trade works. This is how we improve the world. But, I'll make you a deal. In exchange for that Hershey bar, I will give you a Butterfinger bar. How many people in row 2 want to swap the Hershey bar for a Butterfinger bar? How many people want to keep their Hershey bar? The people have spoken. Do you take the Butterfinger bar for the Hershey bar?
Absolutely.
You guys are just doing so well. You are getting way better off. The number of udals, an economist would say you're deriving from having better candy bars. Off the charts. Absolutely off the charts. What am I going to do for you? In exchange for that crappy Butterfinger bar you got, I'm going to offer you a Three Musketeers. How many people in row 2 want to take this deal? How many don't want to take this deal? So what is the will of the people?
Change again.
They will change again. And again, we can do this all day, because row 2 doesn't have ordered preferences. Row 2 isn't a person. Row 2 is a group of of people and groups of people don't always have ordered preferences. Sometimes it depends on the question you ask. And sure, you can design a system. There's a whole school of thought called social choice theory about how you design systems to get around problems like this. But when you're designing a system, you're just trying to get to an outcome. There is no single candy bar that row 2 likes best out of these 3. There is no consensus best. And so it's kind of insane to talk about the will of the people. And thank you very much for both that. And so it's not that public choice theory, that these concentrated benefits and these dispersed costs mean that somehow the lawgiver is thwarting the will of the people when he passes the Flores law, and that really what we need is more voting. It's really just that the Flores law is something you should expect when groups of people make decisions. When there's an opportunity to have concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, you should expect a group of people to take that opportunity. And it's not because they're thwarting the will of the people, because the will of the people isn't a thing. It doesn't exist. Very frequently, there's just no such thing as the will of the people. And to talk about the favorite candy bar of row 2 is to talk nonsense. And so what do? I want to propose 2 answers, and then I do want to leave time for questions, which I think I am rapidly running into. But I want to propose 2 possible solutions to this problem, which is, and in fairness I should stress, this is not a problem with government. This is a problem with humans. This is a problem with groups of humans making decisions. It's innate to human nature. It's innate to people responding to incentives. Any group of people is going to have exactly this phenomenon. We would have it in this room if you put me in charge, which is why you shouldn't put me in charge. And the first thing I want to propose is just liberalism. Liberalism in the sense of allowing people to make their own decisions for themselves. Liberalism in the sense of making as few decisions as possible as a group, and as many decisions as possible as individuals. How many people have purchased a candy bar in the past month? How many people are health nuts? If you didn't raise your hand at least once, you're lying to me. Those who purchased a candy bar in the past month, who had their hand up for a candy bar in the past month? Yes, in the middle. What did you buy? Blue shirt, yes. What's your name? No. What did you buy?
It was dark chocolate with mint from the Lindt market.
Was this a difficult process? Was it challenging?
No, not really. But I tried to eat less milk and dairy, so I should
When you went in, did the people at the store say, I'm sorry, the only thing we're selling today is Butterfinger bars?
No, not really. It was a huge choice of like probably hundreds of them.
So people have a lot of different preferences in the world. Some like to eat less milk, some are health nuts, and allowing liberalism allows us to respect all of those choices. It allows us to have a society where people can have different preferences. And it allows us to get around these problems that arise whenever we make decisions in a group. And I think that's important for 2 reasons. One, it's important because, as we've just established, groups are kind of uniquely crappy at making decisions together. We want to avoid that just because it causes problems all its own, but I also think we want to avoid that just for basic moral reasons. Because there's a sense in a lot of young people I find today that there is something morally wonderful about putting issues to a vote. That it's the greatest way of solving problems, that there's something really just morally respectable in putting things up for a vote. The best thing we can do to decide what candy bar to eat is to put things up for a vote. And I really think that couldn't be further from the truth, and I think that's something that's important to think about. Because what you're saying when you put things up for a vote is essentially, we've talked about this enough, we're going to figure out which group of us is bigger, and then the rest of you are just going to go along. We're done respecting your opinion, we're done discussing this, we're just going to choose something, and we're going to move ahead. And I don't think there's a less respectful thing you can say to another human being than, you know what, I understand I haven't persuaded you that my candy bar preference is better than your candy bar preference. I don't care. I no longer care, and we're going with my candy bar preference. We should avoid that at all costs. But some decisions are going to be made in groups. Some governments exist, societies exist, and some decisions have to be made in groups because they affect large groups of people. And what do we do about that? And that's where I want to make my second suggestion, which is having multiple decision makers. It's a truism of American politics that the American people hate the use of eminent domain. What's happening to Carlos's gym is the least popular thing in American politics. We've been litigating this issue for 15 years, and anytime anyone does a poll, we don't really do polling because we don't really care. Other people do polling, and every time they ask people about eminent domain abuse, about taking private property from one person to give to another, something on the order of literally 95% of people are opposed to it. You should take this person's property and give it to this specific person for a sports stadium. That always seems to happen. Even though 95% of the people agree on the principle that that stuff should never happen, that always seems to happen. And it seems to happen because it's exactly the concentrated benefit dispersed cost thing we were talking about. The person building the sports stadium gets a lot out of that. And one way to solve this problem of everyone agreeing on a principle and not being able to actually put that into practice when they're making decisions as a group is to decide in advance on a set of principles and have a separate set of decision makers enforce those principles, which is essentially what constitutional litigation is, both here in the United States. Litigating to force governments, force legislators who are subject in the moment to these concentrated benefit dispersed cost incentives, force them to live up to these principles we've agreed on in advance. And we've had a phenomenal amount of success doing this at the Institute for Justice. Carlos's gym still stands. We won that trial last year. Leroy Jones started his taxi company with the help of the Institute for Justice. And if ever you're in Denver, I strongly recommend taking a Freedom Cab, which he named in our honor. Christian Elf, the kid from Arizona who was being harassed by the state pest control board, not only prevailed, but the Arizona State Pest Control Board no longer exists, which is the only thing we've ever destroyed. And we do this by persuading courts who are subject to incentives, but are subject to different incentives from legislators, to uphold a set of principles that's supposed to constrain what government can do to you. So what do we do about this? I propose two things. One, liberalism. One, we should make as few decisions as possible as a group. There are all kinds of problems with group decision making. We should rely on individuals to decide things for themselves. But two, where we're going to have government decision makers, we should make sure they're hemmed in. We should make sure they're hemmed in by principles, and we should make sure they're hemmed in by different decision makers who have the authority to veto what they're doing, especially when what they're doing is shutting down Leroy Jones Taxi Company because it means a lot more money for the two taxi companies in Denver. Especially when what they're doing is responding to these concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. It's something we've been trying to instantiate in the United States at the Institute for Justice, but I think those two principles actually apply to any human society anywhere, just as an organizational principle. I think that is, if anything, the takeaway I've had from half a dozen years of doing this. That given the opportunity, government officials will respond to these public choice incentives. They will trample on individual rights. And the only thing we can do is expect that, be ready for it, and have a system in place to stop it. With that, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know how much time I actually have left, because I don't know when I started.
About 15 minutes.
Perfect, that's what I was thinking.